They called me Wrench. Not because I had a name they bothered to learn. Not because I'd earned a title in their language, with its click-stop consonants and that particular tonal drop that marks someone worth addressing. They called me Wrench because I fix things, and to the crew of the sovereignty vessel Ketharin, a man who fixes things is himself a thing useful in the right hand, forgotten when set down. My actual name is Marcus Dell. I was 34 years old when the Keth Protectorate lifted me from a refugee processing station outside what used to be Lagos, where I'd been waiting 18 months for relocation papers that were never coming. I spoke 4 languages by then. I had a mechanical engineering degree from a school that no longer existed in a country that no longer existed, and the kind of practical knowledge that only comes from spending years keeping things running that had no business still running, generators held together with salvaged wire, water systems that hadn't been designed for twice their rated capacity, vehicles that kept moving out of stubbornness rather than maintenance. I could fix almost anything made by human hands. It turned out that skill translated fine across species. The Keth recruiter at the processing station was a mid-ranking logistics official named Veth, who had the permanently distracted expression of someone perpetually behind on paperwork. He walked through the holding area looking at people the way a person looks at tools in a hardware store, not unkindly, not cruelly, just with the specific focus of someone solving a problem rather than meeting a person. When he stopped in front of me and asked, through a translator, whether I had mechanical experience, I said yes. When he asked whether I had experience working in confined spaces, I said yes. When he asked whether I had experience working in conditions that were, quote, suboptimal for biological function, I thought about the 18 months in the processing station and said that depended on whose biology he meant. He made a note, and I was assigned to the Ketharin. The Ketharin was a diplomatic vessel, specifically a floating palace, which is what Keth diplomatic vessels are when the diplomat is a queen. 300 meters of layered titanium ceramic alloy, drive arrays shaped like the ribcage of some vast sleeping creature, interior chambers that smelled of something between cut grass and ozone, and a staffing complement of roughly 200 Keth crew who ran the ship and 30-odd non-Keth auxiliary workers who ran everything those 200 Keth preferred not to think about. The maintenance corridors, the waste processing, the water recycling, the 1,000 small physical labors that keep a ship breathing and moving, and not killing everyone aboard. It carried Her Radiance Queen Velith Sen, last of the Sen dynasty, and her 2 children, Prince Ethan, who was 6 years old and already growing his secondary orbital ridges, the bony crest structure that runs from a Keth's temples back along the skull, more pronounced in males and in the high lineage families, and Princess Riva, who was 4 and had the habit of following me through the maintenance corridors because she liked the sound of my tools and nobody had told her she wasn't supposed to. I fixed the ship. I cleaned its bones. I knew every pipe, every coupling, every conduit housing, every access panel. I knew the cracked seal in the tertiary cooling array that I'd patched 17 times because the replacement part never came through procurement. I knew which of the atmospheric regulators ran hot on the port side because of an original installation error that had never been corrected. I knew the places in the secondary hull where the thermal shielding was thinner than specification, and why, and what temperature differential would make them relevant. There were 3 of us humans on board. Myself, a woman named Cecily who managed the Queen's wardrobe and had quietly taught herself to read Keth script over 3 years, sitting in the laundry room during her off hours with a child's primer, and the patient determination of someone who has decided that if she's going to live somewhere, she's going to learn its language. And a boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, named Petter, who did something in the kitchen that involved a lot of standing still and being yelled at by the head cook. A Keth named Orith who treated food preparation with the gravity of a religious practice and considered the introduction of human culinary instincts to her domain a form of ongoing theological crisis. We weren't prisoners exactly. We weren't crew. We were the word the Keth used for a category of being that sits somewhere between employee and inventory, a word that translates roughly as the hands that don't need asking. You didn't ask us for our opinion. You didn't inquire about our backgrounds. You gave us a task and checked whether it was done and moved on. Somewhere between tool and person, and firmly toward the tool end on the days when things weren't going well. I had made my peace with it. You make your peace with a lot of things when the alternative is fighting battles that don't change anything. I had food, a bunk, meaningful work in the sense that I was doing things that mattered to the functioning of a ship that mattered to people. I had the children, who didn't know yet that I was supposed to be furniture and treated me accordingly, as an interesting adult who made useful sounds and sometimes had snacks. I had 3 years of knowing this ship the way you only know something you've cared for alone in the dark. It was enough, it had been enough. I'd been on that ship for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days when the Ven came. I was in the crawlspace above Deck 7's water reclamation unit when the first impact hit. Not an explosion, more like the ship taking a breath it hadn't planned on. A deep structural groan that moved through the hull plating and into my palms where they rested against the conduit casing, transmitted through 40 meters of metal in that specific way that tells you the sound isn't coming from where you are but from the ship itself. I've felt buildings do that. The moment when the math catches up, and a structure that has been holding a configuration longer than it was designed for sends a signal through itself, a kind of whole-body disclosure. I held still and listened to the ship think. The second impact was louder, more final, the sound of something that had decided, not the sound of something that had happened accidentally, and underneath it, beginning at the same moment, a vibration in the hull that wasn't part of the Ketharan's own systems, a foreign vibration, mechanical and precise, the sound of something inserting itself. Something had docked, not at a standard port, docked the way a blade docks in a gap it's forced open. I pulled myself back through the crawlspace, moving in the hunched shoulder posture I'd developed over 3 years of moving through passages sized for beings somewhat shorter and narrower than a human man. I dropped through the access hatch into the corridor below, landed with the quiet that comes from practice, and moved to the nearest observation port, a small sealed pane in the outer hull, set into the wall of the secondary corridor at chest height, with a view aft and slightly starboard. What I saw was a Ven Cleaver-class vessel. If you don't know what a Cleaver-class looks like, picture a blade designed by something that thinks pain is architectural, not a weapon shaped for efficiency, a weapon shaped to communicate something about the beings who made it. Long and tapered and beautiful in the way that purely functional cruelty can be beautiful, with boarding spines extended from 3 positions along its hull, each spine already punched into the Ketharan at different points along our ship's midsection. They hadn't asked permission. They hadn't sent a hail. The Ven didn't when they wanted something. The boarding spines were retractable tunnels, pressurized, sealed, that allowed troops to transfer from ship to ship without exposure. Standard Ven assault hardware. The fact that they were already extended told me the Ven had made this decision before they'd arrived, which told me this wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. My mind was doing several things at once. Counting 3 boarding points meant significant force, probably 30 or more troops distributed through the ship. Mapping, the boarding points were midsection, which gave them immediate access to the crew habitation decks, the environmental systems, and the main corridors without having to fight past the bridge or engineering. Remembering the Queen's quarters were on Deck 6, Section 4. The children's suite was on Deck 8, Section 7. Engineering was Deck 4. The bridge was forward, Deck 2. I was on Deck 7. I started moving toward the Queen's quarters. I got about 40 meters before the first Ven soldier came around the corner, and I stopped. I use the word soldier loosely because the Ven military caste is something different from what that word suggests in human contexts. Not conscripted, not professional in the way A career military person is professional, but something more integral than that, the way certain social insects have castes that exist for specific functions. Taller than a human by half a meter, with 4 arms arranged in 2 offset pairs, the upper set longer and ending in broad articulated claws that they use for everything from picking up a cup to pulling someone apart. They have no visible eyes in the human sense. Their sensory organs are distributed across a bony crest that runs from the back of the skull down along the spine, reading heat and vibration and chemical information from the environment simultaneously. They see in spectra that don't include most of human visible light. In dim corridors, they track heat. In very quiet spaces, they can read heartbeat. The Ven soldier looked at me. I did not run. Running raises core temperature. Panic is warm and produces specific chemical signatures that the Ven read as predator-prey context. Every piece of instinct I had was telling me to move, and every piece of calculation I had was telling me that moving would be the last thing I did in this corridor. I stood still, holding my tool bag at my side, and I tried very hard to feel like a piece of furniture. The Ven tilted its crest, a slow side-angled movement that I'd seen Keth crew do when they were dismissing something as irrelevant. Then it made a sound I'd heard before from Keth staff when I came to fix something in their section, and they didn't want to be interrupted. A dismissive ticking sound that translates across cultures and species with remarkable consistency. Not worth processing. The Ven moved past me down the corridor. I let out the breath I'd been holding in a long, slow, controlled exhale. My hands were shaking. I made them stop. 3 years of being ignored. 3 years of being the thing you look past on the way to something that matters. I'd resented it in the smaller hours of the night shift. The not being seen. The functional invisibility that comes from occupying a category of existence that the people around you have decided doesn't require attention. Standing in that corridor, watching the Ven soldier move away from me toward whatever it had been sent to do, I revised my assessment. Invisibility was the only weapon I had. I was going to use every inch of it. The Queen's chamber was already breached when I got there. I knew it from the door before I arrived. I could see the light from 20 meters away, the particular quality of light that comes from a sealed chamber with its door forced open, the interior illumination spilling into the corridor at the wrong angle. The biometric lock had been melted. The door itself was off its upper hinge, leaning inward at an angle that had bent the lower hinge assembly, which was rated for significantly more than a door's weight, and therefore said something specific about how much force had been applied. I pressed myself against the wall in the corridor 2 meters from the door and listened. 2 Ven guards inside, by the sound of their armament, the articulated exoframe click that marks officer class Ven, a sound like a large insect moving through dry grass. The Queen's voice, steady and precise in the formal diplomatic register, I'd heard her use in 6 official sessions over 3 years, the one where every word is placed with the care of someone who is choosing their ground for a reason. Then another voice, smoother, with that quality of self-assurance that sits at the edge of every language I've ever heard, the voice of someone conducting a performance of their own victory. A Ven commander. Through the partial gap of the forced door, I could see roughly a third of the room, enough to see the Queen standing, her secondary crown ridge fully raised in the Keth threat display, the equivalent of a person squaring their shoulders and planting their feet. Her formal robes were disordered at one edge, scorched where something had come close. She was unarmed. She was not begging. Whatever the Ven commander was saying to her, she was answering it with a precision that suggested she was choosing every response for a reason beyond the immediate. I didn't see the children. I pulled back in thought. The Royal Children's Suite was 1 deck up, Section 7. I could picture the corridor, the specific section of wall where Riva had once pointed at a maintenance panel and asked me what was inside it, and I'd explained atmospheric regulators for 15 minutes to an audience of one 4-year-old who absorbed the information with the gravity of someone receiving religious instruction. The children had a security protocol. Cecily had mentioned it once, somewhat accidentally, in the relaxed way of someone who'd had a glass of whatever the Queen's physician had left out during a slow afternoon, that at the first sign of hull breach, the royal governess would seal them in the inner berth. The inner berth had its own air supply, 3 days of provisions, and a biometric lock that only opened for the Sen bloodline. Which meant the Ven couldn't open it without the Queen. Which meant the Queen was being managed carefully. Leverage, not violence, a living key to the thing they actually wanted. I stood in the corridor outside the Queen's chamber with my tool bag and my maintenance access card, and the comprehensive intimate knowledge of 3 years spent in the bones of this ship, and I made the decision that was probably the stupidest thing I had ever done. It competed with other finalists. There was the plasma conduit incident. There was the time in Lagos I've stopped explaining because the explanation never makes it better, but this was a strong contender. I was going to the children first. Not because it was tactically logical, not because I'd run the numbers and determined it was optimal, because I'd heard Riva say my name through a door and it sat in my chest like a weight that wouldn't let me move in any other direction. I moved. The maintenance corridors on the Ketherin are sized for their intended users, which meant they were sized for being somewhat shorter and narrower than a human male, and I moved through them in the half-crouch I'd made automatic over 3 years. Not quite a crawl, not quite an upright walk, a compromised position that I could hold for extended periods without the back spasms that had been a feature of my first 6 months aboard. I'd learned to move this way the same way I'd learned everything on this ship, through repetition, through incremental adjustment, through the patient negotiation of a body adapting to a space not designed for it. The sound of the ship was wrong. The Ketherin had a hum under normal operation, not a mechanical sound exactly, more like the sustained lowest note of a bowed string instrument, something produced as a byproduct of the organic drive arrays doing their continuous work. I'd hated that sound when I first arrived. It had kept me awake. By the end of the first month, I couldn't sleep without it. By the end of the first year, I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. The hum was gone. The Ven had cut the drives. We were stopped in the Delveth corridor, the transit lane I knew from the navigation displays in the engineering section, a standard diplomatic route, light traffic, no regular patrol presence. Quiet. The kind of quiet you want when you've boarded a vessel and need time to work. I came up through the service hatch on deck 8, 2 sections forward of the children's suite, and listened. Voices in the corridor beyond, 2 Ven, moving away from me toward the forward section. I gave them 30 seconds, counting in my head, and stepped out. The children's suite door was intact, sealed from inside. The light above the lock panel was amber, active seal, biometric engaged from the interior. I pressed my palm flat against the door surface, not the panel, just the door, and felt the faint vibration of someone moving in the room beyond. I knocked. 2 slow taps, 1 fast. The pattern I'd started using with Riva 9 months ago when she declared herself my assistant during a regulator maintenance visit, because I'd learned early that an alien child discovering an unexpected human emerging from a wall panel was liable to produce a level of noise that could be heard on adjacent decks. A pause. Then, small and afraid and trying very hard not to sound either, wrench. I closed my eyes for a single second. Just that 1 second to settle something. "It's me," I said in Keth, keeping my voice below the level that would carry past the door. My Keth was functional but unpolished crew-grade vocabulary, the verbs of maintenance and request and apology, the nouns of ship systems and materials. I'd been listening for 3 years and I could follow most of what was said around me, but I spoke like someone who had learned a language from the inside of a machine room. Governess Theth, is she with you? Are you both safe? A longer pause, then, Governess Theth is hurt. She fell when the noise happened. A beat, careful measuring. Ethan says he is not crying. 6 years old, the secondary orbital ridges just beginning to define themselves, trying to hold the shape of a prince in a room that had just been shaken around him. Tell him it's all right to cry, I said. Can you open the door for me? The pause this time had a different quality. I could hear it, the working through, the weighing. Mother says only family, and she stopped. Then, but you are the one who fixes things. That is what I am, I said. The lock disengaged. Governess Theth was a Keth elder, 60-something in Keth terms, which maps to a life stage well past human equivalency, with the particular solidity of someone who has weathered a great many things and chosen not to be diminished by them. She'd hit the floor when the first boarding impact sent her into the wall, and her secondary hip joint, the lower of the two hip joints the Keth use, the one that powers their distinctive rolling gait, had failed on impact. She dragged herself with the children to the corner of the inner berth farthest from the door, and when I crouched down in front of her, I could see the bruising along her crest that told me she'd interposed herself physically between the children and something during the chaos. The bruise pattern was consistent with impact absorption. She had used her head. She was conscious. Her eyes were tracking. When I started the brief examination, she made the Keth gesture for manageable pain, a slow lateral movement of the outer finger joints. And then she looked at me with the direct, evaluative look that elder Keth deploy when they've decided to say what they're actually thinking. The Queen, she said. I heard. She's alive and arguing back at them, which tells me they're negotiating rather than forcing, which means they need her functional. I was already doing the quick field assessment of Theth's joint range of motion, stability, pain response to light pressure. Not catastrophic, severe enough to prevent standing. I need you to tell me everything you know about Ven tactical doctrine, ship boarding operations specifically. You've served with the diplomatic fleet for, I looked up. How long? 41 years. Then you've seen the Ven work before. Her chin moved in the Keth affirmative. She began to talk, and I listened with one part of my attention, while another part was inventorying the room. Provisions, access points, the emergency signaling unit behind the panel on the east wall that I'd installed the replacement battery in 14 months ago, the service crawlspace access I'd used twice for atmospheric regulator work, the oxygen recycler in the ceiling that I'd serviced just last week. I was counting what I had. What I had was a tool bag, a maintenance access credential that could open any non-command panel on the ship. 3 years of documented, walked, physical knowledge of every system in the Ketharan's infrastructure. The intimate understanding of a ship that I had fixed and cleaned, and argued with in the small hours of the night shift when nothing was working and nobody was watching. What the Ven had was a boarding party, a fortified bridge position, control of the ship's active communications, and approximately, by Theth's estimate, between 25 and 40 trained soldiers distributed through a vessel they just entered for the first time. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't appear in briefing documents. It doesn't appear in tactical assessments or ship schematics or operational readiness reports. It lives in the hands of the person who has replaced the coupling on the atmospheric regulator for the 3rd time and knows that the housing runs 2 degrees hot on the port side and will torque right if you don't compensate. It lives in the specific angle of the crawlspace above the Deck 6 maintenance junction that you have to navigate left shoulder first, or you'll catch the seam on your right side. It lives in the memory of which conduit sections run hot enough to serve as a navigation landmark in the dark, and which pressure valves release at what threshold, and exactly where the environmental control network's central relay sits in the mechanical core. A squat, warm, humming machine in Deck 4, Section 9, that I had serviced often enough to know its error modes the way I knew the faces of people I'd worked alongside. The Ven knew none of that. The Ven had never fixed this ship. They'd never crawled its bones at 2 in the morning. They'd never replaced a seal in the dark by feel because the lighting strip in that section had been out for 3 weeks while they waited for the part to arrive. They'd never sat in the mechanical core, eating a meal brought from the galley while a diagnostic cycle ran, talking to a machine, because it was the only company available at that hour. This ship was, in every sense that mattered, mine. I looked at the children. Ethan was holding himself with the rigid deliberateness of someone who has decided that composure is a duty. Riva had abandoned any such pretense and was watching me with the specific focused attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. I need to go do something, I told them. I need Governess Theth to stay here with you, sealed in, no matter what you hear outside. The door requires send biometric to open. That's the safest thing you have. I looked at Ethan. Your Highness. If someone comes to this door who isn't me, do not open it. Ethan lifted his chin. I will not, he said, with the precise enunciation of someone performing a promise they intend to keep. Riva grabbed my hand. 4 years old, and her grip was surprisingly strong. Keth children develop upper body strength early, something related to the weight of the developing orbital ridge structure. She held my hand and looked up at me with the expression she used when she had decided something and was informing me of the decision. You will fix it, she said. It wasn't a question. It was the confident declaration of a child who has seen the person she trusts fix everything that broke in her world, and has therefore concluded that this is what fixing looks like. I patted her hand and extracted my fingers gently. That is what I do, I said. The first objective was a Ven communit. The second was information about troop distribution. The third was whatever I could manage to improvise from there, which was not the most reassuring operational plan I'd ever operated from, but it was the plan I had. The Ven had stationed a single guard at the Deck 6 maintenance junction, the choke point that controlled access to the environmental systems for the ship's midsection. One guard told me something about their confidence level. They'd mapped the ship, identified the strategic control points, and decided that one trained Ven soldier was sufficient to hold a maintenance corridor against whatever the Ketharin's non-combat crew might produce. They were not wrong about the Ketharin's non-combat crew. They had not correctly modeled what else might be in the corridor. I came in through the overhead. The maintenance crawlspace above the Deck 6 junction was barely half a meter tall, tight even for the Keth workers it was designed for, genuinely tight for me, requiring a specific body configuration where you move on your forearms with your torso turned slightly sideways and your neck angled down. I knew it well. I'd replaced the routing brackets along that section 8 months ago, a full-day job that had required me to lie in that exact configuration for several hours while I worked above my head. I knew which panel sat directly above the guard post. I knew what that panel weighed and what the removal sequence was, and I knew that if you loosened the corner screws beforehand, which I did, moving in 4-minute increments, resetting between each one when the guard shifted position, you could lower the panel using the vacuum seal on its edges without making any noise worth noticing. I'd done it before. In that same section, working overhead during a late-night maintenance window, trying not to disturb the Keth official who'd fallen asleep in the room below. I worked with the deliberate patience I've learned is the only thing that works in situations where hurrying means dying. Screw 1, wait. Screw 2, wait. The guard below moved, resettled, went still. Screw 3. The panel came free in my hands, silent, the vacuum seal releasing with the softest exhalation. I looked down. The Ven guard was standing with its back partially toward me, crest sensors oriented forward and lateral. Its communit was clipped at the articulation point between its upper and lower arm pairs, standard positioning. I'd observed it on the Ven official who'd visited diplomatically 6 months ago and spent an afternoon standing around looking important. 3 meters below me, no margin for error. I dropped 90 kilograms of Marcus Dell, falling 3 meters, landing on the Ven's upper back with both knees, and using the same instinctive grab that years of working in awkward positions had built into my body. Reaching for the thing I needed in the same motion, I used to reach for a tool I dropped while suspended over something important. I had the comm unit before we hit the floor together. The fight lasted 8 seconds. I want to be honest about this. I am not a combatant, and what I did in those 8 seconds was not skilled or pretty or particularly coherent. It was the product of substantial desperation, the grip strength that comes from 3 years of torquing fittings by hand, the knowledge of which structural housing would produce the most disorientation if applied to a Ven's crest sensor array with appropriate force, and the thermal cable I'd already configured as a restraint, because I'd had exactly enough time to work out what a four-armed opponent being restrained looks like in practice. The Ven stopped moving. I checked that it was breathing. I needed this to be a temporary problem, not a permanent one, and left it restrained behind the water cycling unit with something that was probably a severe headache developing. I took the comm unit. I took the access blade. I took the pulse disruptor from the belt, and I spent 30 seconds examining it before I was willing to point it at anything, because the last thing this situation needed was me shooting myself with Ven hardware because I didn't understand the safety mechanism. I determined the basic firing interface, point, squeeze the main gripper surface. The secondary selector was mode adjustment, and moved. The comm unit was running encrypted Ven tactical frequencies that I couldn't decode, but content wasn't what I needed. I needed the transmission pattern, the check-in interval, the silence tolerance before someone came to investigate. I listened while I moved and counted. Approximately every 6 minutes, disciplined check-ins, which meant I had a working clock now, and the clock said I needed to not be standing still in one place when that interval elapsed. The environmental control relay was my first objective. Theth had explained the Ven environmental control strategy: capture the atmosphere distribution nodes, use selective decompression as leverage. What Theth didn't know, because it was maintenance worker knowledge, the kind of information that doesn't appear anywhere a diplomat or a military commander would look, was that the Ketharan's environmental control nodes were not independently operated. They were networked through a central relay in Deck 4, Section 9, behind the secondary drive interface. I'd been in that room dozens of times. I'd replaced the relay housing's primary seal twice, under the eye of a Keth Systems engineer who had never once asked my name or anything about me, but had stood next to me for 6 hours while I worked and made quiet sounds of approval when I did things correctly. The relay and I had a relationship of the kind you develop with a machine you've cared for over time, not affection exactly, but the specific trust that comes from knowing something well enough to predict its behavior. I moved through the crawlspace to Deck 4 in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The relay housing was exactly as I'd left it 3 weeks ago. A squat, warm machine about the size of a cargo container, sitting in its alcove and humming with the patient dedication of something that has been doing one job for a very long time. I pressed my palm against its surface and let the familiarity of it settle something in me that had been vibrating at too high a frequency since the first impact. The metal was warm against my hand. It smelled like ozone and the specific dust that collects in relay housings, a smell I'd come to associate with the deepest and quietest hours of the night shift. My access credentials opened the housing. I'd registered them properly through official maintenance channels across 3 years of legitimate work. The Ven, who had been on this ship for 3 hours, had not. I opened the housing and went to work, isolating the environmental control network from the Ven's capture nodes, while suppressing the diagnostic alerts required navigating 3 interlocked systems whose shutdown protocols could cascade in ways that would be noticed. I did not hurry. I've learned in the years of doing this that hurry is how you make a temporary problem permanent. I moved through the relays interface the way I'd moved through every difficult technical job, methodically, with full attention on the current step, with the awareness that the step after this one depended on this one being done correctly. The nodes went dark for the Ven, their leverage over the ship's atmosphere gone, quietly, showing on their systems only as a minor diagnostic noise rather than a system event. Then I opened the secondary access channel I'd used for maintenance monitoring and rerouted it to carry a modulated signal on the Keth diplomatic encryption frequency. The Ketharan's transit beacon ran on a separate power cell and a separate transmitter. The Ven would have suppressed the active comm systems, hailing frequencies, standard distress bands, emergency broadcast channels. But the transit beacon was a lesson the Keth had drawn from a disaster 2 generations ago, when a diplomatic vessel in a communications blackout had gone unreported for long enough to change the outcome of something important. The beacon was on its own circuit, independent. Passive under normal conditions, broadcasting position and registry on loop. I added a modulation to the carrier wave. The bandwidth was too narrow for a message, but a pattern, a specific deviation from standard beacon output, would read on any Keth naval navigation system as an emergency deviation flag, the kind that puts a vessel on the Investigate Next Patrol Pass priority list. It wasn't a rescue. It was a whisper in the right direction, pointing toward us in the dark. It was all I could manufacture. I sealed the housing and climbed. 4 Ven in the secondary corridor on Deck 7, moving through the crew quarters in paired formation, 2 moving, 2 covering, systematic and thorough. Officer trained. They'd done this before in enclosed spaces and they were doing it efficiently. I had a pulse disruptor, a tool bag, and a ship I knew better than they ever would. The secondary corridor ran between 2 water distribution lines, port side and starboard. I'd helped install the port side line 18 months ago, working alongside a Keth plumbing crew who had tolerated my presence because I was useful with the coupling fittings and didn't talk much. The port side line ran at higher pressure than the starboard, a calibration difference that had never been corrected because it didn't affect function at normal operation, and the emergency relief valve at the midpoint junction would, if opened, vent pressurized water at high temperature across approximately 8 meters of corridor with no warning. I knew this because I'd installed the safety guard on that valve myself after a junior crew member had bumped it during a drill and soaked an officer who had not found the situation instructive. I went around, maintenance access aft end, junction panel. I watched the 4 Ven through the panel's monitoring grate, timed their approach, and when they were 12 meters forward of the vent point and moving closer, I opened the valve. The sound was something I'd never heard at that scale before, the crack of a system releasing, the sustained roar of pressurized water finding open space, and then a lot of Ven vocalization that communicated, with great emotional clarity across the species barrier, that this situation was not what they had planned for. Hot pressurized water is not lethal to Ven physiology under standard parameters. Their external dermis handles temperatures that would cause serious harm to a human. What it does do is saturate their distributed sensory system, the crest array that reads heat signatures and vibration, with an overwhelming input that produces functional blindness for somewhere between 45 seconds and 2 minutes. A Ven whose crest is flooded with thermal data is a Ven experiencing the equivalent of someone shining a very bright light directly into human eyes. I came through the access hatch. I will not describe those 2 minutes in detail. I will say that I used them effectively, and that I sealed the corridor section behind the 4 Ven using bulkhead locks that required Keth crew credentials, and that when I had finished, I was breathing harder than I'd like and my hands were shaking in a way that I was actively managing, and I kept moving. The Queen's chamber had a secondary entry point, that was not on any tactical briefing document the VEN would have consulted, because it was a maintenance access. A panel 40 centimeters square at the rear of the room behind the environmental unit, leading to the service annex between the unit and the outer hull. I had crawled through it before, for legitimate maintenance reasons, and I knew the interior of that annex the way I knew every confined space I'd ever worked in. By the feeling of it in the dark, the specific quality of the air, the position of every fitting and coupling by the memory of my hands. I came through the hatch and pressed my back against the hull in the annex and listened. Close, very close. The VEN commander's voice was on the other side of the unit's rear panel, and I could hear the texture of the conversation now, not words, but rhythm. The rhythm of a negotiation that has shifted from exploratory to pressurized. The commander was escalating. The Queen's voice was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, which told me something specific about her. She was not adapting to the pressure. She was refusing to let it change the pace. I thought about what I was about to do. 3 years of being wrench. 3 years of being the hands that don't need asking, the thing you look past on the way to something that matters. 3 years of knowing this ship and the people in it in the particular intimate way that you know a place you've been trusted with alone in the dark, with no audience and no recognition. The Queen's atmospheric regulator was above me, the one whose internal coupling I'd replaced, whose housing ran hot on the port side, whose output dial I knew was accessible from the service annex exactly where I could reach it. The VEN's distributed sensory crest reads vibration as one of its primary inputs. High-amplitude vibration at certain frequencies interferes with that sense. I knew this from a research session I'd done once idly, after noticing that a VEN diplomatic official seemed inexplicably agitated in the section of the ship that housed an older model atmospheric unit running above its rated output. I'd looked it up in the ship's technical database, filed it away without expecting to ever need it, and forgotten about it until this exact moment when I needed it very badly. The regulator's output dial was above me. I reached up and turned it to maximum. The effect was immediate and not subtle. The regulator produced a sustained low note at a volume that I felt in my teeth, in my sternum, in the fine bones of my hands where they gripped the conduit. On the other side of the panel, the sound of movement, the VEN's instinctive disorientation response, moving away from the vibration source, toward the far end of the chamber where the signal was attenuated. I came through the rear panel. The room was large, Queen's quarters, triple the space of standard crew cabins, draped in the deep-water colors the Keth favor, lit by the bioluminescent panels she'd brought from the palace on Keth Prime. The light was low and warm and entirely wrong for what was happening in it. 2 VEN guards against the far wall, crests angled in the half posture of disorientation. The commander between them and the Queen, one upper arm raised in the balance gesture that VEN use when their sensory input is compromised. The Queen saw me come through the panel. In the moment that a human maintenance worker appeared through the rear of her environmental unit, with a VEN pulse disruptor in hand, and 3 years of maintenance residue on his face, Queen Velith Sen looked at me with the expression she used when assessing a diplomatic situation and selecting a response. Not surprise. Not relief. The calm, precise intelligence of a person who has spent their entire life evaluating variables and choosing actions. She moved smoothly to her left, taking herself out of my line of fire, creating a clear angle. I fired. I'd like to be precise about this. The truth is that the disruptor had a wider field than I'd expected from my 30-second examination of the mechanism, and I hit all 3 VEN rather than the 2 I was aiming for. The outcome was better than I'd planned. All 3 went down, the full-body muscular interruption of the pulse disruption effect, the VEN equivalent of a strong electric shock, several minutes of recovery time on the floor. The vibration from the regulator kept running. The room was shaking in its foundations. I reached back through the panel and turned the dial off. The silence that followed was the largest silence I've ever stood in. The Queen looked at the 3 Ven on her floor. She looked at me. Her secondary crown ridge settled slowly from its raised threat position, an incremental degrees by degrees descent that I'd only ever seen in diplomatic sessions when she was transitioning from confrontation to resolution. "Wrench," she said. "Marcus," I said. "My name is Marcus Dell." She was still for a moment. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She tilted her head in the Keth gesture of reprocessing, the physical acknowledgement that information received is being reclassified. "Marcus," she said carefully. Then, "the children." "Safe on deck 8. Governess Theth has a hip joint injury. She'll recover. The children are unharmed." I was already moving toward the commander, pulling thermal cable from my bag, working the restraint configuration that 4 arms required. I've cut the Ven's environmental control leverage, neutralized 4 of their mobile element on 7, and added an emergency deviation flag to your transit beacon. The bridge still has their secure element 8 to 12, possibly more, and I don't have a clean solution for that. The Queen crossed to the commander's position, not to check on him. She crouched over him with the specific efficiency of someone locating a particular object, and when she stood, she was holding a comm unit, not the tactical one, but the diplomatic comm unit that a commander of this rank would carry on a separate clip, the rank marker and command channel device. Held it up. The Ven military command structure passes authority to the next tier if a vessel commander fails to respond on the diplomatic channel within a defined window after a boarding operation commences. She looked at the commander on the floor. Her expression was the expression I'd seen in her last 2 diplomatic sessions when the other party had made an error they didn't yet realize they'd made. He has not responded to that channel for considerably longer than the acceptable window. I stared at her. "You were running out his clock." "I was running out his clock," she confirmed. "Keeping him talking, making him defend each position before moving to the next. The Ven operate on a strict hierarchy of command succession. If Sketh Vorel had been unreachable, command authority would pass to the vessel commander, and the vessel commander's standing orders for an unresponsive operation are to recall and report for review. 3 years. 3 years of watching her conduct formal sessions with the precision of someone playing an instrument. And she'd been doing it, that same instrument, the same precision, to a Ven boarding commander in the worst hours of her reign, and she'd been winning by losing slowly, by keeping him here and talking while time passed above his head. "How much longer did you need?" I said. "Perhaps another 12 minutes. She extended the commander's comm unit toward me. "This will allow you to transmit on their hierarchy frequency. Their encryption is not available to us, but the commander's identifying signature is embedded in the device. If you transmit it, the bridge element will receive it as a command origin communication." I took the device. What do I say? The crown ridge shift was small, but I knew her tells now. That particular slight movement meant something adjacent to a grim smile, the kind that lives below the features. She told me what to say. "What you do when you want a fortified position to empty itself out is give the people inside a reason to move that matches their understanding of how their world operates. The reason doesn't have to be true. It has to be credible, and credibility here meant the right signature on the right channel with the right brevity. I know 8 words of Ven military vocabulary. The Queen dictated the rest. I transmitted, recall order operation compromised, extraction to docking point. Brief, authoritative, in the commander's signature. The bridge element, 11 Ven, which was at the high end of my estimate, began moving toward their docking points. Moving through corridors that I controlled, because I knew where every bulkhead door was, and a ship's internal doors respond to maintenance credentials the same as anything else. I moved through the crawl space ahead of them, section by section, corridor by corridor. I closed doors behind them in sequence, herded them forward, not obviously, not in any way that would trigger the alarm of trained soldiers, just nudging the path available to them in the direction I needed them to go. I delivered all 11 of them to the forward docking bay. On the other side of the extended boarding spines hatch was the Cleaver-class vessel's pressurized tunnel. I sealed the internal doors. The Ven, in the forward bay, facing what their instruments would read as a sealed position, with a foreign vessel's tunnel on the other side, made the decision that trained military personnel make when an operation has gone wrong and command is unresponsive. They called for undocking. The Cleaver retracted its spines. 40 minutes later, drawn by the beacon modulation I'd added in the relay room, the emergency deviation flag that had been whispering in the right direction, since I'd turned it on 2 Keth fast-response corvettes, and a frigate dropped into the Delveth corridor, and made the Ven's situation a great deal clearer than it had been. The Ven I'd locked in the secondary corridor on Deck 7, and the 4 in the forward bay who had attempted to undock and found themselves on a ship that would not release them without Keth crew authorization, and the original guard I'd left restrained behind the water cycling unit. All of them became Keth problems. The Keth military is, in my experience, extremely capable when given something specific and physical to deal with. I was sitting in the maintenance corridor outside the children's suite by the time the corvette commanders were finishing their initial assessment. Riva opened the door. She looked at me for a moment, tool bag in my lap, pulse disruptor still in my hand that I hadn't quite managed to put down, sitting on the floor of the corridor with my back against the wall in the posture of a man who has run through his reserves and is rebuilding from base materials. My face was what it was. She examined it with the thoroughness she brought to things she was trying to understand. "Did you fix it?" she said. I thought about this question for a moment. I thought about 3 years of being wrench. The tool bag and the crawl spaces and the 2 in the morning diagnostic cycles and the relay housing and the guard post and the disorientation vibration and the moment the Queen had looked at me and said my name. I thought about the 8 seconds on the floor of the maintenance junction and the 11 Ven walking into the forward bay and the sound the beacon modulation had made when I'd activated it, which had been no sound at all, just a pattern, quiet, pointing toward us in the dark. "Yeah," I said, "I fixed it." Riva considered this with the absolute weight that a 4-year-old brings to a conclusion she has already arrived at and is now having confirmed. Then she sat down next to me in the corridor, pressed her small shoulder against my arm, said nothing else. I sat with her in the corridor while the corvettes finished docking and the ship came back to itself around us. The hum returning to the drive arrays, the lights steadying to their normal register, the sound of Keth naval personnel moving with purpose through spaces that were, once again, Keth spaces. There is a word. I learned it afterward from Cecily, who had spent 3 years reading Keth's script in the laundry room and had accumulated a vocabulary far more nuanced than mine. It comes from the early Keth fleet tradition, the nomadic period when their civilization existed entirely on vessels moving between systems, a period that lasted long enough to leave deep marks on the language. The word names a category of person that the early Keth considered essential in a specific and non-obvious way. Not the commanders, not the fighters, the ones who stayed behind when the commanders and fighters went to do what commanders and fighters do. The ones who kept the ship breathing and moving and navigable, who knew where every seal was and which coupling was about to fail, and how to keep the whole thing from coming apart in the dark. The word translates most directly as the one who remains when the others go. But Cecily said that translation flattens it, that the original meaning carries something additional, a connotation of belonging, a sense that the remaining and the knowing are not merely functional but definitional. That the ship belongs to the person who has cared for it in the dark, and the person belongs to the ship in some reciprocal way that the Keth language considers worth naming. The Queen used it to introduce me to the corvette commander. I was not present for the introduction. I was in the medical bay with Governess Theth, whose hip joint had been confirmed as severe but repairable, and with the children, who had transitioned from the controlled fear of the sealed inner birth to the absolute present tense of children who have been frightened and then were not frightened, and have now moved on to the problem of being hungry. Ethan was asking specific and detailed questions about the Corvette's drive specifications, which was apparently his way of processing stress. Riva had found a piece of equipment in the medical bay that she didn't recognize and was asking me to explain it. I explained it. She listened with the gravity of a person receiving important information. The Queen came to me 3 days later, in a formal session that I attended in my maintenance clothes because those were the clothes I had. Formal, in the sense that she had her second-tier diplomatic staff present and the room was arranged for a declared address. Informal, in the sense that she was looking at me with something that was not the diplomatic register, not the performance of office, but the direct attention of someone who has recalibrated a position and intends to say so plainly. "You are not Wrench," she said. "You were never Wrench. That was a failure of our attention, and I am telling you so plainly because I have been told that human beings prefer plainness to implication when the thing being said is important." I thought about this for a moment. I thought about Cecily, who had taught herself to read Keth's script in the laundry room, and Petter in the kitchen being yelled at, and the 18 months in the processing station before Veth came with his inventory eyes. I thought about 3 years of crawl spaces, and the specific dark of the relay room at 2 in the morning, and the feel of Riva's shoulder pressing against my arm in the corridor. "I'd like to keep the tool bag," I said. The Queen's crown ridge made the small movement. "The tool bag stays," she said. "The name goes." And that was how Marcus Dell, refugee, engineer, maintenance worker, the man left behind when the others went to do what the others were for, became something that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but starts with being seen and ends with belonging to a ship he'd already spent 3 years saving. Not because he fought brilliantly, not because he was trained for it, or chosen for it, or believed by anyone to be capable of it, because he knew every bolt and coupling and failing seal of the thing he'd been trusted with, and when it mattered, he did the same thing he had always done. He fixed it. A month after the incident in the Delveth corridor, that's what the official record called it, the Delveth corridor incident, which felt inadequate the way official language always feels inadequate for the things that happened inside it. The Ketharin resumed its diplomatic schedule. I was in the relay room in Deck 4 doing the standard diagnostic cycling when I heard the ship's hum change pitch. A very slight shift, the specific change that indicates drive mode transition, and I noted it the way I noted everything about the ship's sound. Automatically, below the level of conscious attention, the way you hear a sleeping person's breathing change and know before you're fully awake that something has shifted. Riva found me there 20 minutes later. She had gotten better at navigating the maintenance corridors over the past month, partly because I had stopped trying to discourage her from it, and partly because she had inherited what appeared to be her mother's complete immunity to being discouraged by anyone. She came through the hatch, stood in the door of the relay room with her orbital ridge structure doing the thing it did when she was about to announce something, and said, "Mother says you are supposed to come to the formal briefing." I looked up from the relay housing, the diplomatic briefing. "Yes. That's for," I stopped. "I've been about to say that's for crew." "When does it start?" "It started 6 minutes ago," she said, with the specific delivery of someone reporting a fact while also conveying that the fact reflects poorly on me. I put down my tools, closed the housing, and went to the formal briefing. I want to be precise about what was different. Not everything was different. I still had the tool bag. I still spent the bulk of my working hours in the maintenance corridors and the crawl spaces and the relay room and the various mechanical spaces that kept this ship running. I still fixed things. I still knew where every pipe was. What was different was that when I walked into the formal briefing in my maintenance clothes, because those were still my clothes, because some things change slowly, the Keth second-tier diplomatic staff made space at the briefing table without being asked to. The space they made wasn't at the back or the side. It was at the table. I sat down. The Queen was presenting the diplomatic situation in the Ven corridor. The next phase of negotiations, the response from Keth Naval Command, the implications of the Delveth incident for the balance of protectorate relationships across the transit lanes. She spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, and during those 20 minutes I paid attention in the way I pay attention to things that are important. The way I paid attention in the relay room, the way I paid attention in the crawl spaces, the way I'd paid attention every time something wasn't working and I needed to understand why. At the end, the Queen looked at me. "Marcus," she said, "your assessment." 11 Keth diplomatic staff looked at me. The second-tier officials who had, over 3 years, looked past me to whatever they were actually going to and redirected their attention in my direction, with the particular effort of people recalibrating a habit. I thought about the Delveth corridor, the 6 minutes of interval on the Vencom check-ins, the decision about which problem to solve first and why, the pattern in the beacon carrier wave pointing toward us in the dark. "The Ven will not attempt a direct boarding action again," I said. "Not on a vessel with this profile. What they'll try next is something they can deny, something that looks like a system failure rather than a military action. They'll look for a vulnerability they can attribute to accident." I paused. "There are 3 sections of this ship where that would be plausible. I can show you exactly where they are and what we need to do to close them." There was a silence, not the silence of dismissal, the silence of people taking notes. "Show us," the Queen said. Cecily taught me 3 more Keth words that week. Not maintenance words, not the verbs of fixing and the nouns of systems. Words from the older vocabulary, the fleet tradition language. One of them was the word the Queen had used to the corvette commander, the one that means the one who remains when the others go. One of them was a word that means the ship knows you, which sounds like a metaphor in English but in Keth apparently isn't. Or rather, it's a metaphor that the Keth have chosen to treat as a practical truth, the way that some things we call metaphors are actually just descriptions of relationships that don't have more precise names. The third word she taught me was a word for the specific kind of trust that is built not through declaration, but through action in the dark, when nobody is watching and nothing guarantees that anyone will ever know. I thought about that one for a long time. There's a tradition in human engineering. I'd learned it years before the world I grew up in stopped resembling itself, of signing your work. Not literally, not usually, but the idea that when you do a piece of work well, when you take real care with something that no one will ever see, you're putting something of yourself into it that persists beyond your knowledge and beyond your recognition. That the quality is the signature. That the work knows you did it right, even if no one else ever does. I'd been signing this ship for 3 years. Every coupling properly torqued, every replaced seal fitted to better than spec, every diagnostic run completely, not cursorily, every small repair treated as if someone important was going to inspect it, even in the sections where no one ever came and no one ever would. I hadn't thought about it that way at the time. I just thought about doing the work correctly, which was how I'd always worked. But standing in the relay room a month after the Delveth corridor, with the ship's hum at the correct pitch around me and the Ketharin moving through the transit lane toward the next port, I thought, the ship knew me. Every section I'd ever worked in carried some mark of my attention. Every repair I'd made had persisted in the structure, holding things together, keeping the ship capable of being exactly what it was designed to be. And when the moment came that tested whether the ship was capable of being what it was designed to be, the ship had answered. Because I'd given it good answers to work with. Prince Ethan came to the relay room the following week. This was unprecedented, the relay room being, as I've mentioned, the kind of space that no one with better options spent time in. He came with the deliberate dignity of a 6-year-old conducting official business, which is a specific kind of dignity that I find very hard not to respect. He stood in the door of the relay room and said, without preamble, "I want to understand how the ship works." I looked at him. His secondary orbital ridges had developed another millimeter or two over the past month, which apparently happens in Keth children during periods of stress. The physiological response to challenge accelerates certain developmental processes. He was taller than he'd been a month ago. He was carrying himself differently. "All of it," I said. He considered this seriously. "Start with the part that saved us." I thought about where to start. The relay housing, the environmental control network, the beacon modulation that had been the whisper in the dark. "Start here," I said, and gestured at the relay. "This is the center of the ship's environmental systems. If you understand this, everything else connects outward from it." Ethan came into the relay room and sat on the floor next to me, in the posture Riva used, shoulder proximity, and I started explaining. I explained it the way I explain everything I know, starting with the function, moving to the mechanism, then to the failure modes, then to the solutions. Starting with what a thing is for before moving to what a thing is made of, starting with why before how. He asked good questions. He had, it turned out, a specific and detailed mind, the kind that wants to know how things actually work rather than accepting that they do. He asked about the redundancy systems. He asked why the nodes were networked through a central relay rather than distributed independently. He asked, with the directness of someone who has decided this information is relevant, how I had known what to change in the relay to take back the environmental control. I told him. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "You were not trained for any of that." "No," I said. "But you knew the ship." "I knew the ship," I said. "Knowing something well enough is the same as being trained for it, in the situations that actually matter." He thought about this. "My mother says something similar about diplomacy," he said. "That knowing the room well enough is the same as having a plan." I thought about the Queen running out the clock on the Ven commander, keeping him talking while the window closed above his head, her voice never changing pitch. "She's right," I said. Ethan sat in the relay room for another 2 hours. By the end of it, he understood the central relay and its relationship to the 3 nearest environmental nodes and the basic logic of the beacon modulation system. He learned it the way he seemed to learn everything, with complete attention and a kind of steady patience that was, I thought, something he'd inherited from his mother. He came back the following week, and the week after. Riva came too, eventually, though she was less interested in the systems and more interested in the tools, which she began referring to as our tools, in a way that I found I had no objection to. The Ketharan was still the same ship. The maintenance corridors were still the same dimensions. The relay room still smelled like ozone and accumulated service dust. The tertiary cooling array still had the same cracked seal that the replacement part had not yet arrived for. I'd patched it a 4th time since the incident, and the patch held, and I'd put in the procurement order again and was waiting. But the ship felt different now in the way that a space feels different when you stop being invisible in it. Not louder, not more recognized in the performance and acknowledgement sense. Quieter, in a specific way, the quiet of belonging rather than the quiet of erasure. The two sounds are technically identical from the outside. From the inside, they are nothing alike. Marcus Dell, refugee and engineer and maintenance worker, the man left behind when the others went to do what they were for, ate his meals in the secondary mess with the Keth crew now, when his schedule allowed it, attended the formal briefings, was consulted, sometimes, on ship systems by people who had previously looked past him on the way to something that mattered. Still fixed things, still knew every bolt and coupling and failing seal. Still had the tool bag. Some things don't change because they're not supposed to. Some things that were always yours stay yours, even when everything else shifts. The work is the work. The knowledge is the knowledge. The ship is the ship, and the ship knows who kept it. That's enough. It's always been enough. The only difference is that now someone else knows it too.